This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 117 of Here's How for the 18th of February 2021. We've had Jim O'Callaghan talking about his party's ideas for solving the housing crisis, amongst other things. In this podcast, we have the housing spokesman for the main opposition party talking about that, amongst other things.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast. That could also be when a violent convicted criminal is sent to tell somebody what to and what not to put on Twitter. But I don't want to go on that specific because I see you on Twitter.
No, hang on a second. So we all have the right to our good name. And I take objection to you presenting that particular event as if somehow something sinister happened.
That's coming up shortly. But first I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon, especially an anonymous donor and Eoin Ó Broin, no relation to our guest, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who does that. For the people who don't know, Patreon is a system that allows people to donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month. And that helps me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. If you think you could do the same as Cathal, you could join a queue of donors. There's details on the website and at the end of the show. And talking about researching and finding interesting guests, Kevin, who are you?
God, I'm your assistant producer, William. That one, I don't think I should be caught off guard by such a simple question, but.
Well, I put out a call at the end of last year for anybody who wanted to volunteer to be a galley slave and give their time to help produce the podcast. So you volunteered. So first of all, thank you very much for that. And you can say hello to everyone in the audience. What sort of things are you interested in?
Okay, well, a topic which I am interested in is ageing and demographic shift. Mm-hmm. So Ireland was until quite recently the youngest country demographically in Europe. However, as Ireland's generation of baby boomers, the generation that David McWilliams calls the Pope's children, mm-hmm. as they push onwards towards retirement, Ireland's relatively youthful demographic profile will change, and it might change at a surprising rate over the next couple of years or the next decade. And we don't have that many older people now, but we will relatively soon. Which is quite topical, I think, because in these pandemic times, people have been, I think, dressing up essentially murderous ageism as merely very logical cost-benefit analysis. The arguments that have been used are very simple. The benefit that we get from protecting our grandparents is very small, and the cost is allegedly very high. And for the best example of this argument, I have prepared a segment from US political commentator Ben Shapiro.
Nobody just wants to say the obvious truth, which is that we're all making actuarial deductions about what are the costs in terms of how many human lives, how many years of life, because that is an actual issue in actuarial tables, right? If somebody who is 81 dies of COVID-19, that is not the same thing as somebody who is 30 dying of COVID-19. I mean, if this were killing children, everyone would be in for lockdown forever. That's the reality, right? If a bunch of 5-year-olds were dying of COVID-19 and people were saying get back to work, I'd be like, nope, I'm not letting my 5-year-old die. If grandma dies in a nursing home at age 81, that's tragic and it's terrible. Also, life expectancy in the United States is 80.
So for the initiated, Ben Shapiro, that political commentator, is also famous for the expression, facts don't care about your feelings, which at the time of this recording, he has as his pinned tweet. And similar arguments have been made locally. Many of us probably remember the full page ad that was put in the Irish Times, and it advocated for a more laissez-faire approach to our pandemic response. And it did so by supplying a list of statements, and most of them were about the age of people who die from COVID, or about the age profile of people who die from COVID, saying like, oh, only 2 people under the age of 45 have died in this country from COVID. But here's the fact about cost-benefit analysis. As any health economist will tell you, it's all about perspective. Now, usually when someone advocates for policies that risk the health of a particular group, from their point of view, they'll reap the benefit of that policy and none of the cost. And maybe this reveals how myopic some of what people are saying about the age profile of people who are likely to be very seriously ill from COVID actually is, because I aspire to live to an advanced age myself. I don't particularly care for the next generation of people to point out at this point to make actuarial calculations about what to do with me at this point. And anyway, I think the whole situation is an exemplary case study of why we actually should care about other people's feelings and their perspectives.
And that's really interesting, Kevin. Thanks for preparing that. One thing I noticed was, and I think this facts don't care about your feelings. If you make that your slogan, you better get your facts right. And Ben Shapiro has his facts wrong there, because he says the life expectancy in the United States is 80. That's more or less true, I think so. But the life expectancy of 80-year-olds is not 80. The life expectancy of 80-year-olds is something over 90, as I remember, because, of course, 80-year-olds have already lived to be 80. There's no 80-year-old who's going to die when they're 75. But nevertheless, hopefully we'll be hearing a lot more. I know this is an area of expertise of yours, Kevin, so hopefully we'll hear a lot more from you about that.
Well, it's I did my master's thesis on this, but it's not the area I'm working in at the moment.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line, I have Eoin Ó Broin. Eoin was recently re-elected as a Sinn Féin TD for Dublin Midwest, not the Sinn Féin TD for Dublin Midwest, because he was one of the few Sinn Féin candidates who had a running mate, and they both romped home. Congratulations on that, Eoin. And listeners will know, if they listen to the last podcast, but one, that we were talking to Jim O'Callaghan, in particular about Darragh O'Brien, the Fianna Fáil Housing Minister, and your freedom of information requests came up. In particular, information about lobbying the Department of Housing to have more taxpayer money spent on shared equity schemes and first-time buyer grants. Do you think this is a good idea, that taxpayers' money is helping out people who can't afford to buy a house, helping them to afford to buy a house?
Well, unfortunately, this scheme does not help people to afford to buy a house. I describe it as the crack cocaine of demand-side interventions. Essentially, the way this will work is somebody who maxes out their 3.5 times gross income central bank allowable mortgage will be able to borrow up to €100,000 on top of that by way of a shared equity loan. What that means is they'll be able to buy a house up to the value of €400,000, which is increasingly becoming the average price of a new 2 or 3 bedroom in Dublin. But it's not a normal loan. This will be the state taking an equity share in your property. And as the market value of your property increases, so too does the state's equity share, and therefore the money that you owe the state. In addition to this, there's an interest charge on this shared equity stake that kicks in from year 6. And there's a row going on at the moment between the Department of Housing and Finance and the Banking and Payments Federation over what that interest payment should be at an entry level. But what we know, it will increase over the lifetime of the shared equity loan. So while on paper, government will tell you don't have to pay down that shared equity loan, you can just leave it accumulating as a charge on your property. If you do that, you will be subject to increasingly punitive interest rates. So the total amount of money you could end up owing the state, say in year 10 or 20, could be far greater than the 100 grand, both because the property values have increased and the interest rates have increased. The really big killer, though, in this scheme is it will inflate property prices, and therefore everybody will lose, including the people who gain from it. Because as Robert Watts...
So wait, what you're saying, Eoin, that if you lose, you lose, and if you win, you lose as well. Explain that.
Absolutely. So when the Department of Public Expenditure Reform will be consulted on this scheme by the Department of Housing, Robert Watt, the then Secretary General of that department, said it's very clear industry wants this because it'll push up house prices. Very significant research by the London School of Economics on a similar scheme currently operating over in Britain has shown in areas of high demand and high house prices, for example, London, these types of schemes push up prices. So not unlike the Help to Buy scheme, you feel like you're getting something. You feel like you're getting a lump of cash, but actually the house that you're buying will have inflated in value, and you're also taking on a huge amount of debt. So unlike Help to Buy, which is essentially getting some of your tax back to purchase a home, this one, you will be saddled with a significant level of extra debt, unquantifiable at the start because nobody knows how much the equity stake will increase in value or the interest. But the property prices will be going up, so you're paying more for the property. So everybody is a loser, bar a small number of people on higher incomes. And the research from Britain is really clear. There was a
let me see if I'm getting this right on. If you have, let's say, 150 people who want to buy a house and you have 100 houses, then whatever the 100th person can afford is what sets the house price, and the 101st person just can't afford a house no matter what the prices are. If you give that 101st person an extra 100 grand, they might be able to leapfrog. But if you give everybody an extra 100 grand, nobody can leapfrog everybody. Nobody can leapfrog anybody, and everybody is paying 100 grand more. Is that basically it?
Even worse than that, and let's simplify this down. What it means is that why would any developer in Dublin deliver a residential unit for less than 400,000 euros when they know that the people who today can only afford a 300 grand home will tomorrow be able to afford a 400 grand home? And I use the word afford advisably. But let me make this really important point. The Westminster Public Accounts Committee did a very detailed report at the end of 2019, again on the British scheme. And what they found is 60% of the people who availed of the British shared equity loan scheme did not need it. They were already able to buy a house, but they used the shared equity to buy a bigger a house in a nicer area. So that means all those people who today cannot buy will still be left unable to buy. Just the gap between their income and average house prices will be greater. And a large number of those people who avail of this scheme, thinking that it's of assistance, will be saddling themselves with really significant and unquantifiable debt. This is just the worst way to try and address the housing affordability crisis, because it pushes up house prices, it pushes up debt, rather than focusing on bringing down the actual cost of delivering homes so that regular working people can afford them with their existing salaries and existing macroprudential borrowing rules.
Oh, okay, pause on that, because Mary Lou McDonald, your party leader, has called you a brain box. I won't comment on that, good, bad or indifferent, but I'd say you're probably able to do something that it appears that Darragh O'Brien and possibly also Jim O'Callaghan can't do, which is cope with junior cert economics. And I just want to hear a short clip from a video on the Coláiste na Mí website, which is a school in Navan in County Meath. Let's just hear how they're teaching this economics.
What would you like?
2, please.
That's not enough.
You've increased the price. Why's that?
Because people have more to spend than there are goods to buy, the demand for my cakes has risen. And the price of flour has gone up. I have to pay the miller. And the price of wood for my oven has gone up too.
Well then, you'd better have more money.
Wait a second. I know you. You're inflation.
Well done. Because you're so clever, I'm going to give everyone here a cash prize.
No, don't! If there's too much money around for the same number of products, it pushes up prices and money loses its value.
Now, Eoin, we have very intelligent listeners. You're clearly up with them, as Mary Lou McDonald said, brain box. So you, them, and maybe even me are able to cope with junior cert economics. That seems to be something that's beyond Darragh O'Brien, if we're being charitable about it, and saying that perhaps lobbying from the building industry is not the only thing that's prioritised in his mind. But what I want to do is I want to advance a little bit and maybe forward even onto leaving cert economics. And one of the things that you'll understand, because I'm sure you're capable of that, is that taxation, or the absence of a taxation, can essentially be a subsidy as well. That if you have a background rate of taxation in the economy and everybody benefits from that, they're able to send their children to school, they're able to get healthcare and get all the services of society. If one industry pays much less or nothing in tax, even if they're not getting cash from the government, that essentially counts as a subsidy, because they can send their kids to school as well. They can use hospitals and the services of society without paying, or at least without paying the going rate. Would you accept that?
I would, but let me make one slightly different observation, because there's a lot of confusion about our discussions on house prices. So, basic economics tells us that the price of something is determined by the supply and demand for that product, right? So if demand increases because people have more money, then the price will increase. Likewise, for example, if the supply is constrained, more people want it, so the prices go up. Housing is slightly different because its price is determined by the supply and demand of three separate things. One is the supply and demand of houses, and we know that. The second is the supply and demand of credit, and the third is the supply and demand of land. So what we've got at the minute is supply is too low. Land is ever diminishing. And what government is proposing is to increase the supply of credit, which will increase the demand for an ever scarce resource of housing. And that's going to push up prices. And again, Robert Watt, the former Secretary General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, in his emails to the Department of Housing on this scheme, made very clear what we do not need at the moment is an expansion of mortgage credit. What we need is supply-side measures to drive an increase in the volume of housing, preferably lower price affordable homes, not increasing the volume of lending into the economy. So pause on
that thought for a second, because you said that one of the main constraints, and in my view, it's really the main constraint, because there's very little that the housing market needs that can't either be put on the back of a truck or the back of a Ryanair flight from Poland or whatever. We can import building materials if we absolutely can't manufacture them locally. We have very successfully brought in huge amounts of building workers, particularly from Eastern Europe. We can't import land. So the land, and you're correct that credit is important there, but the land is the key constriction. And if somebody who works an hour's overtime in McDonald's pays more tax on that than a millionaire and in some case billionaire land speculator, not only is that outrageous and immoral, it's also the case that distorts the market. And if you have one industry that is taxed at the going rate and another industry that is not taxed, it is inevitable that the untaxed industry will suck in talent and investment and capital, and not to mention political muscle. And that industry will become way more profitable, and property speculation is that. And one of the problems in Ireland is that we have almost the entirety of our tax base focused on working, on selling things, VAT, on income tax, on so forth. Sometimes tax on company profits, which is also, we would hope, a little bit tax on working. But there's no tax on land, which is pretty much unique in the OECD. And in your manifesto, and right now on your website, when you say on your page about reforms, the first point, not a point, the first point is to say abolish unfair taxes, the property tax. You also mention water taxes, but your first point is to abolish property tax. And when you say to introduce a wealth tax, you're saying that farmland should be excluded from that. And of course, all of that housing land, which is being kept off the market, is marked down as farmland. You're as bad as the rest of them, aren't you?
No, and in fact, if you look at the detail of our proposed wealth tax, it doesn't do what you're proposing.
And by the way, land is the only thing that can't be emailed out of the country, so it's going to be pretty much impossible to catch anything. Property is the only thing you can really tax.
Sure.
Shares and whatever really are just tokens that represent value. They're not of value themselves.
No, you can tax all assets, and what's really good about Pierce Doherty's net wealth tax is it looks to tax all assets held globally by taxable residents in Ireland. What we've exempted from it is productive farmland. So if you're actively engaged in the process of farming and creating employment, then we're not going to tax your land. The vast majority of, first of all, let me answer your first question. The vast majority of land that is being sat on speculatively for the purposes of residential development isn't farmland. Almost all of that land has been bought, is residentially zoned for housing. There are a few exceptions, and actually has active planning permission. So in the context of our net wealth tax, all of that land would be taxable. We also strongly propose for a significant increase in the vacant sites levy. I mean, the idea, for example, of charging somebody a 3% or a 7% tax on vacant sites when inflation in the land market, particularly in urban areas like Dublin, is twice that, makes absolutely no sense at all. So both the way in which we've constructed our net wealth tax, but also our proposals in relation to the vacant sites levy would address much of what you're proposing. But the really big scandal in all of this actually is what's happening at the capital gains and the rent roll tax for the real estate investment trusts, because again, they're the key player in all of this. And the current regime, as you know, is not to tax either capital gains or rent roll. And for non-resident investors not to tax at a dividend withholding level. We would abolish all of those tax breaks So actually, we have 3 layers of addressing exactly the problem that you identify.
And can I just explain, because you went through that quickly a little bit. It might be hard to catch Apple profits because it's hard to say where the tax on iPhone sold in Poland, made in China, designed in the US. It's kind of hard to nail that down. But rent paid on an apartment in Dublin, there's no question where that jurisdiction is.
So be very clear, if I'm a real estate investment trust, particularly one whose investors are non-resident, and if I spend millions and millions of euros, much of which I've got at a very low interest, if no interest rate through quantitative easing from the various central banks around the world, I can buy entire apartment blocks in Dublin. I can rent them out at the top of the market, 2,500 to 3,500 euros a month for a standard 2-bed. I pay no tax on that rent roll. Then within 7 years, I flip that asset at huge capital gains. I pay no tax on that capital gains. And then my investors, when they get their dividends, because they're non-resident, don't have to pay a dividend withholding tax in this state.
We understand that. We understand that. That's fine.
Let me make the point. That is the single biggest driver of speculative investment and therefore rising land, rent and house prices, particularly in Dublin, as last week's Society of Chartered Surveyors report shows. That's where we need to focus our attention, not hiking up property tax and hard-working families in small residential units.
But hold on for that then. Not all agricultural land is equal. On average, agricultural land in Ireland is 10 times more expensive than agricultural land in France. And there's a reason for that. And I don't think you're correct to say that all the potential housing land that is being held as vast and largely untaxed wealth, that it's not being marked down as agricultural land. Agricultural land in Ireland goes for 10 times the price it goes for in France because agricultural land has internalized the speculative value that it might or probably will at some stage be sold, rezoned and so forth. And if you go further than that, so that's the average within Ireland. There are big variations within Ireland. So for example, allegedly agricultural land in rocky Wicklow is much more expensive than agricultural land in boggy Leitrim. Both of them are not terribly fertile, but Wicklow obviously has a far higher speculative value than Leitrim, and Wicklow is maybe 20 or 30 times the average land price in France and other continental countries. Why is it? And by the way, land prices typically track population density. So the higher the population density, the higher the land prices, more demand. It's fairly simple. And the only exception to that is Ireland, with the lowest population density, has far and away the highest land prices, probably double tiny little Luxembourg. So you're not correct that agricultural land is not a wealth other than just employing hard-working people. I'm not sure if there's any non-hard-working people. People only work a bit. But that's not correct. That is a huge wealth asset in the country, and you're saying don't tax it at all.
Well, first of all, if the land is in productive use, then the productivity that is being extracted from that land is taxed. But also, you need to understand 2 very significant additional bits to this discussion. So the first is the National Planning Framework introduced by the government 2 years ago, which is a statutory framework, has now set very significant caps and targets on population growth, not just, for example, in Dublin, but in all the commuter belt. And what you're actually seeing is land is being dezoned because it is surplus to residential requirements, particularly around the commuter belt. What you're also seeing is, for example, when we did the last South Dublin County Council development plan, no new land was being zoned. And the pieces of land where speculative land investors currently in South Dublin County Council are seeking for it to be rezoned is not agricultural land. It's either brownfield or it's zoned for general amenity. Now, I'm not saying, for example, that some people aren't taking...
But what's so special about farmers? What's so special about farmers? If I have any other big asset, why I should pay tax on it?
Let me answer your first question, right? My point is, you are saying that failure to tax agricultural land is feeding land speculation and driving up land and house prices. What I'm saying is, particularly in the greater Dublin area, the commuter belt, that is not what is currently happening. And the correct use of planning policy, the correct use of zoning policy is the best way to address that. And that then means that anybody who is thinking about taking a speculative punt in a piece of agriculturally zoned land, for example, on the foothills of the Dublin Mountain, is making a very foolish bet. But what I would also say is where people are engaged in productive activity, where you own factories or where you run farms, in my view, the best way to tax that is in terms of the productive outcome of that land. But then when you seek to sell that land, we have capital gains tax to deal with that. The real issue in Dublin, and this is, I suppose, where I think you need to shift the conversation, we have large volumes of brownfield sites that are no longer required for brownfield. I mean, the Nace Road, for example, and that stretch between my own local authority and Dublin City is the key one.
Just for listeners, that's old sites that were previously built on and now are derelict.
Well, in the main, they're not derelict, right? They have a variety of uses in them. Exactly, right? And some dereliction. But the key issue is we need to bring all of that land into different kinds of uses. But of course, if you just rezone it residential, you give a huge windfall gain from land value extraction to the current owners. So we have to think creatively about how we capture land value increases for the public good. And actually, taxation isn't always the best measure. Sometimes it's about the creative use of zoning to ensure that there is a proper dividend to the state in terms of housing affordability, the provision of good quality community infrastructure, etc. Because what we actually need on a lot of that land is larger volumes of social and affordable homes and community infrastructure, not necessarily tax revenue.
Okay, I want to park that there because I have a couple of other things I want to talk to you about. In particular, for listeners who don't know, what is democratic centralism?
It's a very outdated way of doing business that was particularly prevalent in left-wing parties. But I suppose the principle is very simple. When a party is setting its policy, it does it democratically through its members at a conference. And once it's agreed, then the party managers at the centre of the party ensure everybody adheres to that. I wouldn't say that that's the exact way we operate today. We come from that democratic centralist tradition, as most political parties do. But as the party grows and evolves, we have greater levels of flexibility.
So you don't adhere to democratic centralism anymore, is that correct?
It wouldn't be as rigid as it was traditionally. So policy is still made, and we're unique in this form. Policy is still made by the delegates appointed by their local commons at an Ardesh every year. Unlike, for example,
pause on that. I should say for
no. Let me make the point, right? Unlike Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, policy is still made by the members of the party through democratic policy-making forums like Ardesh's, rather than by a cabal around the leader. And when those decisions are made, we absolutely have to adhere to them as elected representatives. But there's far greater flexibility in the operations of the party across the state, as there should be. So it's that mix of democratic control and accountability and flexibility, and I'm quite comfortable with all of that.
Okay, I should say for listeners, I don't know if the term, but the idea certainly comes from a pamphlet written in 1902, 119 years ago, by Lenin, Vladimir, not John. But the reason I ask about that is because Sinn Féin certainly seems to have a reputation and also perhaps a problem with this. And there is a level of discipline, and I use that word in every sense, within members of Sinn Féin that is really striking. Are you sure that's healthy? And the one case that I'm sure you're aware of is a young activist, a young woman, I think about 22 years of age, who formerly now was a member of Sinn Féin. She has left, Christine O'Mahony. She was in Meath Sinn Féin, and she made what I thought were pretty spot-on criticisms of one Sinn Féin TD in particular. Would you stand over the way she was treated?
No, and I've spoken about this publicly on RTE. First of all, individual members of the party should be free to express their own opinions as they want. And nobody in the party structures should be telling individual party members to remove things from Twitter accounts and all of that, unless clearly it's egregiously offensive or racist or homophobic or sexist.
Oh, and pause on that, Eoin, because in particular, she was not saying something egregiously wrong. She was in fact tackling, in one case, Brian Stanley, who wrote a plainly homophobic tweet. He has withdrawn it. He has apologised for it. That's fair enough. She describes herself as a member of the LGBT community as well. She criticised him, and she ended up having a violent convicted criminal knocking on her door, telling her that she wasn't entitled to say this. I think you can be fairly confident in saying that Brian Stanley didn't have anybody, convicted criminal or not, banging on his door telling him to remove those tweets.
So let's be very careful with our language here. So let me to answer your question in two parts, because it's an important question. First of all, no party member should have asked Christine to remove the tweet. Nobody should have done that, and it's not consistent with party policy. That's the first thing. The second thing is the individual concerned is a very close friend of Christine's family. He's a neighbour and he's a party member. Now, you're absolutely right. The individual, I couldn't tell you.
Right? 60s maybe.
But let's just be very, very clear, right? This is somebody who is known very well to the family, is a family friend, and is a member of the party and holds a particular position in the party structures in the local area. But my core point is as follows. individual party members should be free to express their opinions so long as they don't breach those core rules of decency of public debate that I've outlined.
Would you agree,
before.
Owen, that when you have a much more senior man in his 60s knocking on the door of a 22-year-old woman, there is a very significant power differential there, and there's a power dynamic going on there?
And whether he was 20, 50, 60, male, female, he should not have called and asked her to remove the tweet.
And I accept you saying that. I accept you saying that, Owen.
But
go on.
Because let me explain something very important. There are two different sets of, I suppose, restrictions. I'm an elected representative for Sinn Féin. And therefore, when I speak, either on this programme or on Twitter or in the media, I'm representing the party. And therefore, I have to speak in line with the party policy as democratically agreed by the party members. But when an individual activist or member engages in social media, they should be free to express their opinions as individuals. They shouldn't be constrained in the way that I, as an elected representative, am rightly constrained to speak in line with party policy, etc. Sure, I can give my personal view on a range of issues. So I suppose the core point is this, is that we want to encourage a culture where party members can discuss and debate freely, with the caveat that it should, of course, be in the context of a respectful public debate on any issue. And that's why on the weekend that story emerged, I was the first senior party official to say nobody should be telling party members what they should put on their social media accounts.
Oh, okay. Hold that idea. Pause that idea.
Just let me make one final point. We do have very clear social media guidelines for all party members, but they are about the limits of good public discourse around racism, homophobia, being insulting, and all that kind of stuff. And they should apply to all of us.
Okay, they didn't appear to apply to Brian Stanley. That was a 3 or 4 year old tweet. In fairness to you guys, somebody went trawling through it, I suspect, perhaps from the right-hand side of the political spectrum, but they found it, and that was something really pretty nasty that Brian Stanley had said, and unquestionably homophobic against Leo Varadkar. There's plenty of things to say against Leo Varadkar without getting into homophobia. But Owen, would you agree that equivalent words, and sometimes even identical words in a different context, can have entirely different meanings? So, for example, if somebody is protesting against police violence in the US in the Black Lives Matter protest and has a slogan Black Power, that means something completely different to a Ku Klux Klansman shouting a slogan White Power. They are not equivalent or mirror images of each other or whatever. And I'm sure you would agree, perhaps you remember sometime, I think late 80s, early 90s, Desi O'Malley, who I'm sure you would agree was a committed constitutional nationalist. I'm sure you don't have much agreement with his politics. He said, there are some people in the law library who deserve to be taken out and shot. Now, if Gerry Adams had said that at that time, you accept that would have had a completely different meaning and would have been vastly more threatening than when Desi O'Malley said that, yes?
What I'd say is two things.
But address that directly. So, and really the question I'm asking can be boiled down into 2 words. Context matters.
Well, 2 things. Let me finish the sentence because this is important. Context does matter, but it's also incumbent on those of us in public life that when we comment, that we're also very conscious that the way in which people will hear the words we say may not be the way in which we intend those words to be heard, and therefore offence can be caused when offence isn't attended. And that doesn't just mean an offence, it can mean grievous offence. So that absolutely context is crucial. Yeah. And Brian Stanley's tweet is a good example, right? Brian Stanley's tweet was incredibly foolish, right? Brian shouldn't have tweeted that, and he was right to apologise. But I want to make very clear,
years later,
because I know Brian Stanley a long time, right? Brian is a lifelong campaigner for LGBTIQ rights. And at a time when a lot of other politicians who are elected to the Oireachtas today wouldn't talk about and campaign and march on that issue, Brian did so. Having said all of that, his tweet caused enormous offence, and a politician of his experience should have had the wit to know that. And
do you think somebody would be reasonable in thinking the mask slipped?
No, I think if Brian wanted to make a political point, which he did, right, he should have been much, much more careful about the words that he chose.
Why should he be careful?
Because when you choose...
Surely if he's just speaking his heart.
I suppose 2 things. Brian didn't set out to be homophobic. There's not a homophobic bone in Brian's body, and I can say that with some authority. But Brian's tweet caused enormous offence, and not just to Leo Varadkar, by the way, to members of our own party and members of the wider community, particularly LGBT members of our community.
Okay, you have said that. I don't want to get hung up on that specifically. I don't want to get hung up on that specifically, and I accept what you say.
I want to answer your question, which is when we speak, we have to be very mindful not only of the context and the intentions of our words, but how those words will be received to ensure that we don't unintentionally offend people, as well as guarding against intentionally offending anyone.
Oh, okay, that could also be when a violent convicted criminal is sent to tell somebody what to and what not to put on Twitter. But I don't want to go on that specific because I see you on Twitter.
No, hang on a second. So we all have the right to our good name. And I take objection to you presenting that particular event as if somehow something sinister happened. If somebody who is a neighbour of mine and a good friend of mine that I have known throughout my entire life and a friend of my family's calls, that is not threatening and intimidating. Having said all of that, he shouldn't have called.
Hang on, that contradicts what you said a moment ago. You said that people should be mindful of how it is seen as well.
I am, but
are you saying that was entirely not sinister? You're saying that nobody could reasonably perceive that as sinister.
What I'm saying is for the family involved, for a
answer the question. You're a yes or no? Could any reasonable person perceive that as sinister?
I am answering the question. For the family involved, for a close friend of that family, somebody well known to them to call, I think the way in which you're presenting it is incorrect and unfortunate.
Okay, so you're saying that it could not reasonably be perceived as sinister?
No. I've answered the question in terms of...
Okay, that's fine.
You've
answered it. The listeners have heard that. And you're on Twitter frequently, and you know how Twitter works. By the way, the great bulk of the population are not on Twitter, but just for the people who are not, what you see on Twitter is typically either your first order contacts, the people who you follow, and sometimes something from the second order contacts, the people who they follow, the people who you follow, and maybe even third order contacts if somebody who you follow commented on something they saw. So you can get that. But of course, the vast bulk of Twitter is not in contact with you at all. And when somebody like Christine O'Mahony gets a whole slew of vile comments, a huge number of them coming from accounts that don't have a real name, have, clearly made up names, that don't have profile pictures, and very often have both names and pictures that clearly allude to and celebrate violence. For example, some of them I saw had this sign, "Danger Sniper at Work," from the people who shot snipers at British soldiers at long range in the late 1990s. Various of those accounts. When a huge number of accounts that are not first or second or third order contacts, are not in any way related at all, start commenting on somebody's feed, it's pretty clear that what's happened is a message has gone round to a quite large group of people. And they're saying stuff that's largely consistent. For example, messages in that tone clearly from Sinn Féin supporting accounts, with things like "you're a traitor and we have ways of dealing with traitors," "the punishment for treason is well known and we will apply it to the letter," and "we have not forgotten your betrayal of the Republican movement, and your campaign of slander against senior Republicans is being actively monitored, and you are hereby warned to comply with the social media policy which applies to all members, current and former." That is incredibly threatening, isn't it?
It is, and let me say two things. First of all, that kind of behaviour, either online or offline, is not acceptable, and it's not acceptable.
But this is clearly coming from an organised group.
First of all, let me answer the questions in the order that you're asking, okay, because you're making a number of assumptions. But the first thing is that behaviour is unacceptable, on or offline. That's the first thing, and it shouldn't happen. And again, I've said this repeatedly in public. If any of those people think that they are supporting Sinn Féin or assisting Sinn Féin in that kind of behaviour, they are not, and they should stop. But what I would also say is two things. First of all, there is nobody in our party who is organising any of that.
How do you know?
Nor is there, because I have very, very good visibility on the organisational activities of our party as a senior party member. What I'd also say is there is nobody in the party, an in-party organisation, who is encouraging or condoning that. We have to find a way to tackle the way in which small but significant groups of people are abusing social media. And I'm not shifting the subject, but I want to slightly broaden the conversation, because if you look, for example, my colleague Fintan Warfield and the appalling vitriolic homophobic abuse he's received. If you look at the current mayor of Dublin, Hazel Chu, and the absolutely outrageous treatment that she's getting, Roderick O'Gorman, for example. But
you would agree that, for example, the abuse of Hazel Chu doesn't come from within the ideological space of the Green Party. It's plainly coming from a different ideological base, and that's not the case with this.
Let me go to the point I want to go to. For example, Peter Kavanagh, who's recently left the Green Party, accused people who are supporters of his party of sending him appalling messages, accusing him of similar things. My point is this. We have a very particular problem with social media, which is because it is not properly regulated. Because, for example, social media platforms aren't treated as publishers, because anonymous and at times accounts that might not even be centered around people but could be controlled in other ways are permissible, then it's the Wild West of communication and publication, and stuff like this happens. So I would say two things.
But do you think that Sinn Féin has this problem on a par with other parties?
And this is the two questions I want to address. The first thing is, every political party has to address this, and has to both, in terms of what we say publicly and what we do internally, limit these types of activities among people who are claiming to be our supporters. But we have to go further than that. We have to regulate social media platforms as publishers. You should not be able to say on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, things which you cannot say on mainstream media platforms. And therefore, I would go much further than simply saying parties need to get their house in order, which all parties do. We also have to regulate.
But it sounds, Owen, it sounds like spreading blame around there. Would you accept that Sinn Féin has a particular problem here?
So first of all, two things. I'm not spreading blame anywhere. What I'm saying is there are.
But you accept Sinn Féin has a particular problem?
And again, I'll answer your question in the orders that you've asked. Do I think that our party has a particular problem in this field? No, I don't.
Seriously?
I simply do not accept it. And the reason why I'm saying this is because neither you nor I know who the holders of many of those accounts are, because exactly as you rightly said, those people are anonymous, they don't have photographs, they don't have adequate names. So we don't know who these people are, and that is not acceptable.
But Owen, hold on for a second. We can see, for example, on the attacks on Hazel Chu, we can see that comes from within the ideological sphere of a couple of far-right groups. We can see that the abuse of some former Sinn Féin members, most prominently Christine O'Mahony, is coming from, and actually I accept what you say, that you don't have any information that they're actually within the party, but they're most certainly coming from within Sinn Féin's ideological sphere.
And well, first of all, the problem with these accounts is we don't know who the hell they are. We don't even know if they're real people, if they're people who actually have the political beliefs they're proclaiming to have on social media. But we also know of other occasions in the Green Party, in Fine Gael and in Fianna Fáil, where party members, including elected representatives, have been subject to online harassment and bullying from their own parties. They've been widely reported in the media. But my point is this. What's my responsibility as a member of Sinn Féin, as a legislator? One, it's to say to people very, very loudly and clearly, if you are a supporter of our party, this is not acceptable behaviour, stop doing it. Two, as a senior party member that has responsibility organisationally within a particular constituency, to make sure not a single one of our party members that I know are engaging in this activity. And three, as a legislator, to say, let us legislate to properly regulate platforms. So I don't care who's engaged in this activity. It is simply no longer permissible because we properly regulate online platforms of communication in the same way we do all of the media. That's taking responsibility on three levels. And we need everybody to do that in the political sphere.
Okay, rather than then, perhaps I'll tackle the question in a different way, rather than asking what you think or what has been proven, whatever, would you accept that a great number of reasonable voters would come to the conclusion that those accounts are Sinn Féin supporters? However unsanctioned by the party, do you think that reasonable voters will come to that conclusion?
No, because we don't know who these people are.
No, we don't know, but you can have a good guess. And do you accept that many reasonable voters will guess that people who make hundreds and hundreds of tweets supporting Sinn Féin are probably Sinn Féin supporters?
And again, what I'm saying to you is, if I don't know who a social media account belongs to, right?
We don't know, that's true. We can't prove it. Fake name, fake photograph and so forth. But do you think that reasonable voters will conclude that most of those accounts are probably held by Sinn Féin supporters? Yes or no? Come on.
I think what reasonable voters will do is two things. Is they will look and listen to what political parties and party leaders and party activists like I say and do. But what they'll also say is...
Don't be a politician on me, Owen. You're being way too slippy. Yes or no? Answer the question.
The best way to address all of this, because I want to make sure we clean up social media for everybody, is to legislate, to regulate the platforms as publishers, and that fixes this problem across the board. That's the most reasonable thing that most reasonable voters want us to do.
Eoin Ó Broin, one of the Sinn Féin TDs for Dublin Midwest, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much, William.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here'sHowPodcast, and follow Owen @Eoin Ó Broin, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to Cathal and all of the other patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as Cathal and the others and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, please go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website, and there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.